Every now and then in Five Nights at Freddy's, we get some new information that fully recontextualizes what we thought we knew about something else. And in the current era of Five Nights at Freddy's, it seems like most of the puzzles we have are just questions we haven't yet been given the answers to. But luckily, Secret of the Mimic might have actually given us enough information to solve a puzzle from the last game, Help Wanted 2. Because Candy Cadet, who up until now we thought was explaining the past of Five Nights at Freddy's, may have just been telling us the future. Well, technically it happened in the past, but the future of the games to come. Slices, put on your earbuds, let's make yourself theory. Now, before I can say what these stories are trying to tell us, I should probably go over what the stories actually are. And I was debating on how best to do this, because they're fairly long stories, and I feel like if I start this video with 3 minutes of me saying a story, people are gonna click off. And if I play the Candy Cadet version, that's like 5 minutes. So I was trying to find a happy medium. I don't know if it's the best solution, but it's a solution. I'm going to summarize the story, but while I do, I'll have it displayed on screen. So if you want to read the full thing, you can pause and read it. Now, the first story we received from Candy Cadet in the modern era actually wasn't in Help Wanted 2, but instead in Ruin. You get it by collecting tokens around the FNAF 6 pizzeria at the end of the game. And if you do, you hear this story. It tells of a boy and a mother who lived in the woods with a monster in their basement. And one day while the mother was out, the monster, who had learned her lullaby that she sings to the boy, sings it from the basement. The boy then opens the basement door. Now, before we move on to the other two stories, we're actually going to stop here for a moment. Because truth be told, this story isn't really a part of today's theory. You can interpret this story in many different ways. But I think the game of Security Breach Ruin presents this story to the player fairly clearly. We, as Cassie, are on the way to the final confrontation with the Mimic. And by now, things have started to show that they're not quite right. Gregory's voice had been breaking up over the walkie-talkie and sounding somewhat weird and robotic. We're being told to do things that we wouldn't want to do and don't make sense, and there's just this general feeling of dread the further and deeper we go. Then we hear this story, and immediately after it, we encounter the Mimic, a robot who's been copying Gregory's voice to trick us into letting it out. Now, many of us in the fandom went into Ruin knowing about the Mimic. If you've been reading the books or just paying attention to the fandom discourse online, you would have already kind of expected the Mimic to be there. And then once you played the game and heard Gregory over the walkie-talkie being weird, it all but confirmed it. But for the casual player, who isn't super in the fandom or super into the theories, this game is the introduction to the Mimic. Another door, and still I'm back here. One of these doors has to be the exit, or else I'm gonna lose my mind. At least there's a sponsor every time I get back. Today's video is brought to you by Fume. Cravings are about the habit, the hand-to-mouth motion, the oral fixation, that momentary pause. When that loop is broken, cravings spike, and Fume helps to replace that habit straight away. Fume is not a vape, e-cigarette, or anything like that. I don't support smoking, and I would not promote it on my channel. There's no nicotine, no batteries, no vapor, or anything like that. Fume is a weighted, twisty, fidget-friendly, flavored air device that gives your hands something better to reach for when cravings spike. I eat when I'm bored. It's my big problem that I'm really trying to work on. And whenever I'm at my desk and I feel that boredom coming, I'm lucky that I've got Fume on my stand right next to me. So instead of grabbing for chips or something, I can grab my Fume. Half the time I just grab it to fidget with, to twist it in my fingers, hear its clicking adjustments. Or with the Fume topper, I can even chew on it to fix that oral fixation. That is exactly the moment where Fume works. It helps you to break that habit cycle by replacing it with something better. And if I want to draw my breath through the device and actually have a flavor in my mouth, there's tons to pick from, my favorite being crisp mint. If you're ready to break the habit, now's a great time to try Fume. Right now, when you grab a Journey Pack, you'll get a free Fume topper if you use my code RYTOAST. The Fume topper adds a soft, replaceable, chewable mouthpiece to your Fume, giving your mouth something safe to chew when cravings hit. Grab this offer while it's available. Head to tryfume.com, that's TRYFUM.com, and use code RYTOAST to get your free Fume topper with a Journey Pack today. Thanks again to Fume for sponsoring today's video. This is the first time the Mimic is ever clearly shown and shown what it can do. And it's that player who I think the story is primarily for. I think the entire point of this story is to prime the general audience for the idea of the Mimic. Because if you have no idea who the Mimic is, you've been thinking you're talking to Gregory this whole time, and then you go to the last room of the game, and you find out that some random robot had been pretending to be Gregory this whole time, and then it tries to kill you. That's really out of left field. That doesn't make any sense. But right before we encounter the mimic, we hear this metaphor, this story, about a monster who tricks somebody into letting it out of the basement by pretending to be someone that person trusts. And ruin, we let the mimic out of the basement because it pretended to be somebody we trust. It seems very clear to me that this story is Steel Wool trying to explain the deal with the mimic in a subtle foreshadowing way. Again, there are many different ways to interpret this story, and all of them are valid. But to me, this is the most obvious answer. But I am bringing up this story now because it's very often lumped in with the Help Wanted 2 Candy Cadet stories, for a good reason. And I know that if I didn't mention it, there'd be tons of you in the comments asking why I didn't mention it. So here's my answer. Although, now that I think about it, comments are good for the algorithm, so go and leave the comment anyway. And also like and subscribe if you're not, because apparently 40% of you aren't, and that would actually really mean a lot and help support the channel in a free way to you. Anyway, what are the stories I wanted to talk about then? The stories that are relevant for today's theory are found in Help Wanted 2. There's 2 stories, in fact. One of them is incredibly short and seems like maybe a joke, and the other one is a good bit longer. That first story kind of just feels like an advertisement for Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The story is that a family is offered the deal of a lifetime, the deal being for pizza, but they refused the deal and they all died. The second story, however, is the meatier one that most people theorize about. It tells of someone who confronts a witch in the woods, and they lose, but they survive, being left permanently scarred. Later in life, they return to the woods to once again face the witch, but this time they meet a small boy, and following that boy's advice, they go into a house and rest. The story ending with, the witch then gets her meal. Essentially, the little boy was working for the witch and tricked the person, so they actually died the second time they confronted the witch. When Help Wanted 2 first came out, a lot of us were scratching our heads, trying to figure out exactly what Candy Cadet was trying to tell us here. Most of us ignored the first story because it seems like mostly a joke, and focused on that second story. And there's a lot of really compelling explanations and theories for what that second story is supposed to mean. Many of them assumed that we were talking about Glitch Trap. One of the most compelling theories I'd heard I've already talked about on this channel. It was from ID's Fantasy, saying that this story was talking about Jeremy. The fact that in Help Wanted 1, he faced off against Glitch Trap and escaped, using the paper slicer, left permanently scarred, but lived. And now he's the protagonist of Help Wanted 2, facing off against Glitch Trap again, but listening to Helpy, a little boy, and being tricked by him to falling into Glitch Trap's trap. And that is a 100% valid theory, and frankly, probably more likely than what we're getting into today. But what's the harm in a fun thought experiment? Think about the context in which we get this story. Help Wanted 2. An interstitial title, one between Security Breach and Secret of the Mimic. Help Wanted as a game was not only a celebration of Five Nights at Freddy's, but an interstitial title to introduce and get us interested in the new era of FNAF. The next game even, Security Breach, with Glitch Trap as this overarching villain. Help Wanted very clearly serves as an introduction to Glitch Trap, why he exists, and what he's capable of. So if we look at Help Wanted 2 in the same lens, then it should similarly be an interstitial title existing to help introduce and explain the next game. So theoretically, it should be teaching us about these stories, and more of Help Wanted 2 than we thought, might be centered around Secret of the Mimic, and teaching us about the origins of the Mimic itself. It's a thought that hadn't crossed my mind that much, to be honest, because by the time the Secret of the Mimic came out, I was way more focused on what it's telling us in the game, not what previous games were telling us about it. And that's honestly a blind spot on my part. I mean, right before the game came out, we got a massive Help Wanted 2 update all about Secret of the Mimic. So it shouldn't be surprising that Help Wanted 2 had a lot to do about Secret of the Mimic. But it wasn't until somebody submitted a theory to the podcast that I gave it serious thought. On the weekly podcast, Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, I do on this channel, I take theories from Patreon comments and emails. And Momo left a comment that, like the Candy Cadet stories, are a bit too long to fully read out here, but her general premise were that these stories are all about the Murray family and the origins of the Mimic. So how would that line up? The most immediate connection to make here is the Witch in the Woods, because M1/F10N4, the Mimic recreation of Fiona Murray's personality, chooses to directly display itself as a witch in the woods. Like, nearly exactly that. This is the face of M1. And hey, Scott, you're not slick. I know a System Shock reference when I see one. But this face is important, not just because it looks like Sun, and not just because she ate and left no crumbs. Mama, that jawline is crazy. But the fact that in Moon.exe, this face shows up again as a hermit who lives in the woods with the general aesthetic of a witch. The large cloak, the strange pots of liquid, repairing masks. It's very ethereal and weird. This whole area is so witch-coded, it's crazy. So the idea that the last game had a story about a witch in the woods, and the very next game had M1 being a witch in the woods, that's a pretty clear connection. But if M1 is the witch in the woods, the mimic is this enemy, then who faced off against it? Who's the little boy? Well, to find out who the main character of the story is, we would need somebody who's faced off against the mimic twice. The first time, they'd have to fail but survive and be scarred, and the second time, they'd have to fail and die. Now, we don't have any confirmation of anybody doing that, but the way I look at it, there's decent speculation for two candidates, Edwin and Arnold. Look, I had not believed that Edwin Murray survived for the longest time. The last we hear of him is struggling under the rubble of an explosion M2 set up for him, saying he can't feel his legs, and the mimic saying they're not going to call for help for him. I thought that dude died, but that was before the silhouette update. An update Secret of the Mimic got that put this humanoid silhouette walking back and forth of an office across the warehouse that you see at the beginning and end of the game. Now, I go more into it here on why exactly it means this, but this silhouette essentially proves that either a new human character we have not met yet is at the facility, or Edwin Murray survived. And if Edwin Murray did survive, then there is an incredibly strong case that he is the guy who confronted the witch in the woods in the story. After all, if he lived that explosion, then he would have confronted the mimic, survived, but was left permanently scarred. Now, we don't have any hard evidence saying that Edwin was permanently disfigured in some way, but like, the last thing we heard from him was saying that he can't feel his legs while under a bunch of rubble. It's not a stretch to say he was changed somehow. And then the rest of the story would just need to be slotted into a future game. Edwin would have to try and stop the mimic again, but be tricked by some boy and fail. Now, there is precedent for this happening, in the books at least. Well, there's no little boy in the second confrontation, but you get the idea. The Tales from the Pizzaplex books are a separate continuity than the games, but they still detail a version of the game's events. In that version, while we don't get to see the initial confrontation between Edwin and the mimic outside of him beating it half to death, we do get to see a much older Edwin Murray, one who has since returned to Fazbear. And in the story, The Storyteller, Fazbear has reclaimed the mimic AI and is putting it inside of the Storyteller to run the facility. Edwin notices this, has a panic attack, and goes to try to stop it, until eventually he's trapped inside the Storyteller and suffocates to death. In other words, he faced off against the mimic once when he was younger and was maybe permanently changed, but it's hard to tell, and then later in life tried again, was tricked, and failed. So if this is happening in the games, when does Edwin try again? Well, it might be in the very next FNAF game. After all, one of the most recent mysteries of FNAF is who Gregory's friend is. At the end of Ruin, we have to run through a series of caves following Gregory's directions. But Gregory's directions come from his friend, one that knows the layout of these caves. And that friend might be Edwin Murray. After all, if after the events of Security Breach, Gregory and Vanessa, if they both survive, want to try to put a stop to this, which, judging how Gregory talks at the end of the Security Breach, is more than likely, then they would have to start researching into what the mimic is. And if they found out anything about it, they might have learned about Edwin Murray, who, if they found, may be willing to help. Okay, so that's one possibility. But what about Arnold? I mentioned he might have been the guy who faced off against the mimic, lived but was scarred, faced off again, and then died. Well, admittedly, there's less evidence for Arnold to have survived Secret of the Mimic. After all, in the two possibly canon endings, neither of them look very good for him. In one, Arnold hands over the data diver to M1 and then gets captured and killed, and then in the other one, he escapes with the data diver, but ends up in a fiery car crash. Now, I want to be clear, the more I've thought about this game over the past year, the more I lean to the give the data diver up ending, the bad ending, as being the canon one. After all, this ending leaves the data diver in possession of M1, and M2 seemingly content to stay within the FNAF 6 pizzeria, watching the show being put on. The next time we see the Mimic is trapped in the FNAF 6 pizzeria. So the idea that they're just here, waiting, and eventually William Afton comes down to find M1 and see all this going on, contains the Mimic and starts experimenting, makes a lot of sense. At least it makes a little bit more sense than the Mimic escaping with its own schematics, only to end up back in the FNAF 6 pizzeria. But for a moment, let's assume that second ending is canon, which is technically still possible. The idea that Arnold escaped with the data diver, with the Mimic schematics on it, gets caught in a fiery car crash, the Mimic retrieves it, and leaves us to die in the car crash. But who's to say that we definitively die? Okay, look, I'm not trying to say that this is an easy thing to shrug off, but we know for a fact that Fazbear is desperate for the Mimic schematics that, as far as their intelligence is aware, Arnold had and left the facility with. So it's not unlikely that Fazbear would have sent somebody to go scope out what happened. Not necessarily to save Arnold, but to retrieve the schematics. We know they're desperate for these things. Fazbear sent multiple employees to their death just to retrieve these schematics. If they have any inkling it's on a road outside the facility, they're sweeping that road. And if they find Arnold and he didn't die in the crash, then they could rescue him. Especially because the schematics aren't on him. Even if Fazbear doesn't care if he lives or dies, he knows where the schematics went, so they need him alive. And if he did survive that car crash, then where would he come back into the picture? Well, frankly, the same place Edwin would, being Gregory's friend, the one who's trying to help Cassie get out of the caves at the end of Ruin. Whether it's Edwin or Arnold, this really seems like the most likely spot that the person who survived comes back into the story. Sure, it's like 50 or 60 years later, but they're just giving information. They're not action hero trying to save the day. And I especially think it's something that hasn't happened yet, because think about how unsatisfying it would be if it did. Imagine the grand twist and reveal is that Edwin or Arnold survived Secret of the Mimic, but then died off screen later. What's the point? So this might be what the Candy Cadet story was talking about. Someone who faced off against the Mimic in their youth, survived but was scarred, and later in life is going to try again, but fail, being tricked by a boy. Now, is that boy Gregory? Could be. We don't know what his state is at this point. Could be Cassie. After all, it doesn't have to be a boy. None of these are one-to-one. They're metaphorical stories. And if the Brazil ending is canon in Ruin, Cassie's mind was likely taken over by the Vanny mask. So she, being the bait to make the person who survived die, would line up perfectly with this story. And this is all really solid. But for me to really believe a theory about this story anymore, I needed to talk about both. Not just the witch story, but the pizza deal. Because pretty much every theory I've made or seen about this story completely ignores the pizza deal. Because, it seems too silly. But Momo didn't. In her comment, she mentions this might be telling us that William Afton killed Edwin Murray to obtain MCM. And while I disagree with that, this general idea of obtaining Murray's costume manor might be spot on. Murray's costume manor was on the brink of bankruptcy. Sure, the collapse of the company was being expedited by William Afton's sabotage, but Edwin Murray was running that company into the ground well before William started to help dig its grave. And just as they were about to lose everything, William, or Fazbear, or a pizza restaurant, offered them the deal of a lifetime. William offered to buy up the entire company and all of its assets, but leave Edwin Murray as head engineer and let him keep the house for free. And again, I'm not saying William Afton's a good guy here. He sabotaged this company and maliciously tried to end it just so he could buy it up and use its assets. And as head of Fazbear is willing to send countless employees to their death to retrieve the assets. He is an incredibly scummy businessman. But if I'm Edwin Murray, and my company is on the brink of bankruptcy, about to foreclose any day now, and a businessman, whoever it is, says, hey, let me buy up your company, I'll let you stay in a similar role, you get to keep your job, and you can keep your house for free. I'm taking that deal. That is a deal of a lifetime. Now, we don't know if Edwin accepted or refused the deal, but we do know that he did not trust William Afton at this point in the timeline. So I think it's safe to assume he refused. But I don't think his answer truly matters, because soon after would be the audio log where Edwin is trapped in the explosion of his office, under the rubble saying he can't feel his legs, and the mimic leaves him to die. And if he does die, then this story is true. Fiona and David are both dead by the time this offer even happens. But soon after Edwin refuses William's deal, he also ends up dead. In other words, a family was offered the deal of a lifetime by a pizza restaurant, they refused, and they all died. Both of these stories are about Secret of the Mimic. Just like how the hidden lore in Help Wanted is mostly about security breach, it's seeming like more and more of the lore of Help Wanted 2 was about Secret of the Mimic. In fact, it makes me want to look back at the ending of Help Wanted 2 and see if that's supposed to tell us anything as well. But for that, you'll have to return to Rytoast again, and maybe I will tell you a story. So the Candy Cadet stories might have been about Secret of the Mimic this entire time, and I really like this theory, but I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to go to tryfume.com, that's tryfum.com, and use code Rytoast to get your free Fume topper with the Journey Pack today. Thanks again to Fume for sponsoring today's video. In the meantime, if you want to hear more about my thoughts on what the next FNAF game is, I have a whole prediction video right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share with hashtag ToastArt, and a huge thank you to the Patreon members that make this entire job more feasible in light of fluctuating ad rates. And a special shout out to our breadwinners, Aiden and Marks. And until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.